Ms. Gunn was charged with violating Britain's Official Secrets Act. Catherine Gunn, Daniel Ellsberg, Norman Solomon, and others provide commentary. This event, hosted by American University here in Washington, D.C., is about 2 hours.
Okay, good evening. Thank you all for joining us tonight. My name is Peter Kuznick. This is actually a regularly scheduled session of my Oliver Stone's America History class that we're joining. The class is going to take a break from discussing Oliver's controversial movie JFK to talk about another controversial topic, Catherine Gunn's leaking top secret government document in an attempt to stop the Iraq War before it began, before over 4,000 American and Allied troops and hundreds of thousands, perhaps over 1 million Iraqis lost their lives and saw their country reduced to shambles. In 2003, Catherine gained international prominence when she revealed an illegal U.S. effort to spy on UN delegates in the run-up to the Security Council vote to authorize the Iraq War. Sadly, her efforts proved too little, too late. They certainly fueled outrage in England, where the public and the media were already overwhelmingly opposed to the war. But they hardly made a ripple in the United States, where supine and brain-dead corporate media chose to ignore this remarkable story of one woman's courageous stand against the Bush administration's reckless drive to war. Bush is not the first president to lie to the American people in order to get them to support a war. He's not the first president to cherry-pick intelligence. He's not the first president to exploit the public's fears. He's not the first president to use dirty tricks and surveillance to silence war critics. He's not the first president to be willing to tear up the Constitution in the name of national security. This is an old American tradition, and one not to be proud of. Let me briefly, since it's a history class, survey some of the recent wars. In 1898, an explosion destroyed the battleship Maine in Havana Harbor, killing over 260 U.S. soldiers. Americans immediately blamed Spain, though no evidence has ever been adduced to prove Spain's involvement, and after 4 inquiries, experts still can't agree who, if anyone, was responsible. But U.S. newspapers clamored for war. Congress declared war against Spain purportedly to deliver Cuba from Spanish tyranny and bring freedom to the Cuban people. The fighting began thousands of miles away in Manila Harbor, Manila Bay, where Commodore George Dewey destroyed the Spanish fleet. One anti-imperialist noted, "Dewey took Manila with the loss of 1 man and all our institutions." When the dust of war settled, the U.S. had secured the beginnings of an overseas empire, annexing Hawaii, acquiring Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines from Spain. In 1901, the U.S. Congress dispelled any lingering illusions regarding Cuban independence and democracy. It passed an amendment asserting the U.S. right to intervene in future Cuban affairs and control the Cuban economy, and gave the U.S. a naval base at Guantanamo Bay that some of you have heard of. After the war, American businessmen swooped in, grabbing all the assets they could seize. United Fruit Company gobbled up 1.9 million acres of land for sugar production at 20 cents per acre. By 1901, Bethlehem Steel and other U.S. businesses owned over 80% of Cuban minerals. We've seen that pattern repeated over and over again. Woodrow Wilson ran for re-election in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war," while fully intending to get us in. On April 2nd, 1917, he asked Congress for a declaration of war, saying, "The world must be made safe for democracy." As part of the effort to sell the war to a skeptical public, the government established an official propaganda agency, the Committee on Public Information, which recruited tens of thousands of 4-minute men who gave patriotic speeches in public venues across the country. It flooded the nation with propaganda touting the war as a crusade for democracy. It also asked Americans to inform on fellow citizens who criticized the war effort. Professors who spoke out against the war were often fired. Others were cowed into silence. Congress passed the Espionage Act of 1917, the Sedition Act of 1918, which together created a climate of intolerance toward dissent. Hundreds were jailed for opposing the war. Few of Wilson's 14 points remained in the final treaty. The victors, particularly Britain, France, and Japan, divided the former German colonies and holdings in Asia and Africa along the lines established in the secret 1915 Treaty of London. They also carved up the Ottoman Empire. Wilson rationalized his acquiescence by arguing that the Germans had ruthlessly exploited their colonies, denying their citizens basic human rights, but the Allies had treated their colonies humanely, an assessment that was greeted with incredulity by the inhabitants of those Allied colonies, like French Indochina's Ho Chi Minh. Even our best presidents have been guilty of misleading the American public. Despite his 1940 campaign promises, Roosevelt was eager to get the U.S. involved in World War II. U.S. and British military officers began devising a joint military strategy almost a year before Pearl Harbor. In August 1941, Roosevelt met secretly with Churchill in Newfoundland. And Churchill wrote, I quote, "The president said that he would wage war, but not declare it, and that he would become more and more provocative. If the Germans didn't like it, they could attack American forces. Everything was to be done to force an incident that could lead to war." Though some might excuse Roosevelt, his deceptive behavior in the lead up to that war, as a necessary manipulation of public opinion in a just cause, which it was, in my opinion, future presidents would also take it upon themselves to play fast and loose with the truth in manipulating the nation into unjust wars. Most of you know about the lies, both blatant and subtle, that preceded the U.S. invasion of Vietnam, and I trust that all of you are aware of the lying and fear-mongering that preceded the invasion of Iraq. The pattern has been repeating itself with Iran, and the response to recent developments in Georgia is equally troubling. Many of us tried to prevent the Iraq War, but Katharine Gun was in a unique position to do something about it, and she acted forcefully and courageously, knowing full well the price she might have to pay. There are many who regard her as a hero, but there are also many who think of her as a traitor and believe her behavior was reprehensible. One caller to the Diane Rehm radio show on Monday said that he thought she should be executed. We've assembled a very distinguished and expert panel today to discuss Katharine's actions and place them in a broader ethical, political, and historical context. Some of my students and others in the audience might someday be faced with a similar dilemma to that which Katharine confronted. Some no doubt already have. Let me introduce the first speaker, who's going to give some background to how this all came about. Marcia Mitchell is a prize-winning journalist and former senior executive with the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. She retired as an associate director of the American Film Institute. She wrote this book, The Spy Who Tried to Stop a War, Katharine Gun and the Secret Plot to Sanction the Iraq Invasion, which is on sale here tonight. It's her fifth nonfiction book. It's co-authored with her husband, Tom, who's in the audience somewhere. Tom, in the back. Tom was an FBI agent for nearly 20 years, and he retired as vice president of Georgia Pacific Corporation. Their critically acclaimed 2002 book on the Judith Copeland Cold War espionage case was named Counterintelligence Book of the Year by the Association for Intelligence Officers. So let me let Marcia speak first to introduce tonight's session.
Thank you, Peter, and thanks to American University for inviting us here tonight. This is a very special occasion for us. Tonight is about a woman of conscience who took an action that she thought was critical. She tried, as Peter said, she tried to stop a war. In so doing, Katharine risked her career, her future, and her freedom. I'm not going to take a lot of time to talk about what happened, what Catherine did, and what happened immediately thereafter, because Catherine is here to tell her story. Martin Bright is here to tell what happened when Martin, a journalist of great integrity, also risked his career and his freedom to print, to publish the leak that Catherine created, that she brought to the public. Martin risked a great deal to do that, and we, not only that, but he risked a lot to fly from London to be here just for tonight, and we are very grateful. I would say also that Catherine has come from London, from England, just to be with us tonight, and we're grateful to her as well. She's traveling with a 10-week-old baby. Now that's courageous. So this book is about a woman of conscience. It's about a man of integrity. It is about a media that, as Peter noted, an American media that slept through the whole tawdry affair of an illegal spy operation against members of the United Nations Security Council. We hope to have tonight a lively discussion. We're looking at a true symposium where we get a free flow of ideas, where we have varied opinions presented about related topics. We want to talk about the issues that were raised in this book, such as loyalty, betrayal, patriotism, global ethics. Those issues were brought to our attention in a unique way through what Catherine did. It's time that we discuss this. We think that this story is the critical missing piece in that whole picture of deception and deceit and spin that is now being unveiled by a number of writers. We're hearing a lot about that whole paradigm of behavior on the part of our government and on the part of the UK government. So this, we say, is the critical missing piece, because nobody else has the story. Nobody else has written about it. All of the new books coming out about that whole exercise of deception, not a one of them mentions this case, which had profound significance in the failure of the US and the UK to get UN sanction for a preemptive strike against Iraq. I need to take note of two speeches that have just taken place here in the United States. One, George Bush appearing before the United Nations and saying how important and relevant the United Nations is, and that it must establish greater transparency. Transparency. It was under his watch that we spied illegally against that very same body that he's talking about. Also, former Prime Minister Blair spoke yesterday at Yale University, and he was, saying that it was very, very important that we recognize the value of our having gone into Iraq for the purpose of regime change. Regime change as a purpose for war is specifically outlawed by under international law. Our international accords, to which we are a signatory and to which the UK is a signatory, outlaw going to war for the sake of regime change. There's a quote here that I'd like to share with you. Right after the case against Catherine collapsed, for good reasons that you'll hear, Tony Blair, who's talking now about truth, said, "If it is being said that the legal opinion of the Attorney General, meaning an okay to go to war, was different from the Attorney General's statement to the House, that is patently absurd." When they asked him, when he was talking about Catherine's case, they said, "Was there ever any doubt about the legality of the war?" And he said, "Absolutely not." And that, of course, was a lie. One other quote I'd like to share with you. General Michael Hayden, who's now head of CIA, was head of the National Security Agency when this spy operation was revealed, the illegal operation. And he says, "I have to be certain that when I'm asking an intelligence officer, what I'm asking an intelligence officer to do is consistent with the Constitution, the laws, and the international treaty obligations of the United States." And with that, I will leave you with Catherine to tell her story and Martin to tell his. Thank you.
Okay, our next speaker, Catherine Gunn, the subject of the Mitchell's new book and of tonight's symposium, is a former British Secret Service officer, a Mandarin translator with GCHQ in Cheltenham, England. She was 27 when she was arrested for leaking information on the illegal U.S. spy operation against members of the UN Security Council. Her arrest and trial created enormous interest abroad, who were hardly noticed in this country. What she did that fateful day in January 2003 changed her life forever. Sean Penn has said of Catherine that her action was, quote, "an act of conscience in a world where nobody celebrates that. She will go down in history as a hero of the human spirit." Catherine Gunn.
No, please sit down, please sit down. Please sit down. Thank you all for being here. I'm sorry if you hear any squeaks and squawks and cries from the back. There's a 10-week-old baby that's way past its bedtime. But I had to bring her here because I'm still nursing her, and I'm afraid she'll get hungry, and I didn't want to leave her at home. So I hope you forgive me. And I can't believe that I'm here again, because I was here in 2004, possibly in the same room.
Yes.
Was it the same room? And here I am again, telling my story again to hopefully a fresh bunch of faces who haven't heard the story before. So I'll begin with the day that I went into my office at GCHQ. It was a Friday. It was January, it was cold, and I opened up my computer and started reading my emails, and one of the first emails that I saw was an email that was from the NSA. It had been forwarded from one of my superiors about 3 levels above my position. And as I read the email, my eyes just got wider and wider with disbelief. Because at that time, certainly in the UK, Iraq was the hot topic of the day. And I was glued to the television every night trying to get as much information as I could about what was going on and what the political leadership of the day was going to do about it. And I believed that what Tony Blair and George Bush were saying publicly, the fact that they were going to try and find a diplomatic solution, I believed what they were saying, because I thought, well, surely the last thing we need is another war with Iraq, because they faced sanctions for 10 years, the people are impoverished, the country is pretty much back to a third world country, and the last thing we need is for the country to be bombed to smithereens. But when I started reading this email, I realized that in fact what their agenda was actually war with Iraq. And I was dumbfounded, because I thought what they were saying publicly was deception. They were lying to us. This email revealed that NSA was mounting a surge against 6 swing nations who were sitting on the UN Security Council at the time. Now, these 6 swing nations are all small countries, much of them impoverished, and relying on international and United States aid. And basically what the email was saying was, we need information against these diplomats so that we can use this information against them in order to secure a yes vote for the second resolution, which would give the UN and give the US authorization to attack Iraq. And I just couldn't believe it. I was so angry by what I read, because I thought, if this authorized an invasion of Iraq, it would set a precedent of a preemptive attack on a country which had done nothing, absolutely nothing, to attack either the UK or the US. And so I sat there mulling over this email, steaming at my desk, and I went home that weekend with the thought kind of percolating in my mind that if I got this information out to the public would grab hold of it, MPs in Parliament would grab hold of it, and hopefully Tony Blair would be pushed into a corner and the UK wouldn't support the war with Iraq, and the whole thing would just collapse and we would reach a diplomatic solution. So on the Monday morning, I went into work and I surreptitiously printed off this email with my heart pounding because I knew that what I was doing was illegal already, and I was so scared that I was going to be found out. I slipped this email into my handbag, and for the rest of the day it was like a red-hot iron in my handbag, and I took it home, walked through the gates, knowing that I was already breaking one of the toughest laws in the UK. And then I sent it to a sympathetic friend who I've never named because she has no other part in this apart from the fact that she delivered this email that I sent her to another journalist whom Martin knows and whom Martin will probably talk about later. So once it was out, I had no idea what was going to happen to it. I didn't know whether it was going to get printed. I didn't know if anybody would take any notice of it. And for 3 weeks, it didn't come out, and I sat there thinking, oh, well, maybe it hasn't come out. Maybe nobody's interested. Oh, well, maybe that's a good thing because, you know, I'm not going to get into trouble, and my life is going to go on as usual, and I'll just sweep this under the carpet, and nobody's ever going to know about it. And then one Sunday morning, I went to my local grocery store, and I picked up the Observer, which was the usual Sunday newspaper that I bought, and on the front pages was the exact replica of the memo that I had sent to my friend, and I just turned into jelly, and I was stood there trembling in the grocery store thinking, oh my Lord, I'm going to be found out. And for the rest of that day, and for the following Monday, I was a nervous wreck. GCHQ obviously was immediately aware of this massive revelation, massive breach of their secrecy, and so they mounted an investigation at work. And because the email went to about 100 people at GCHQ, each and every one of us were being individually interrogated by a security officer from GCHQ. Well, my turn came on Tuesday, and I thought, okay, I'm going to try and deny this, because I thought I need to protect the people that were involved, and I obviously was trying to protect my own backside, for lack of a better word. And so I denied it. But after I denied it, I sat there thinking, but this means that I'm going to have to lead a double life for the rest of my life if they believe me. And I just felt full of guilt for lying about something that I'd been involved in. I went home that night, I was physically ill. I was just so distraught by the enormity of what was happening and the decision that I knew that I was going to have to take. So on the following day, a Wednesday morning, I went into work and I went to my boss and I told her that I'd done it. Following that, I was then taken into police custody. I was arrested by London Metropolitan Special Branch Police, and they came down all the way from London. It's about a 2.5-hour drive down from London. Arrested me, took me into the local police station, and kept me there overnight. So I was there in the police custody. Luckily, it was Wednesday's a quiet night. Friday night's the busy night with all the drunks and the various other odds and sods. But on Wednesday night, I was the only person in police custody, so I got pretty good treatment. And then on the Thursday morning, they formally interviewed me, and I was released on bail. And I was bailed for 8 months. And for 8 months, I was sitting there thinking, well, what's going to happen to me? Am I ever going to be charged? And I was just living day by day with this great big thing weighing down on me, feeling an enormous amount of pressure. And finally, in November, they decided to charge me. So I was charged with breaking Section 1 of the Official Secrets Act in the UK with a maximum sentence of 2 years. At this point, I had a fantastic legal team defending me. They're similar to the ACLU. In the UK, they're called Liberty. They're an amazing organization. They have a tiny amount of funds, but they did a superb job for me. They acted as my PR organization, they acted as my shoulder to cry on, and they acted as my legal team. And eventually, we came up with a plan, and we decided that what we wanted to do was ask for the legal advice, because we'd heard it through the grapevine that the then Attorney General of the UK, Lord Goldsmith, who is a political appointee by Tony Blair, and who also was one of Tony Blair's best friends at university and shared a flat with him at university, that he had provided 2 different legal opinions to Tony Blair prior to the war in Iraq. So our defense team said, please submit to us every single scrap of paper, every piece of note paper you have on the legal opinion prior to the invasion of Iraq. Well, would you believe it? 24 hours after that, suddenly the prosecution, which was so eager to charge me at the beginning, dropped all charges against me, saying that there was no evidence. And we looked at each other in absolute delight, but also surprise, because how could they say they had no evidence when I myself had confessed to the crime? And basically that's my story. But those 8 months up to the point that my charges were dropped were kind of exciting at times, depressing at other times, really lonely. But the time afterwards was probably a time that I haven't spoken about much. And I don't know if other people have been in this position, but I think it's probably fairly common amongst people who've been through experiences like these. For about 2 years, I really suffered. I think I suffered from depression, but being a typical Brit, I didn't really express my feelings, and I kept a stiff upper lip about it. And it's only afterwards that I finally kind of realized that I wasn't really normal. I wasn't being myself, and for 2 years I didn't like talking about the story. In fact, I would get palpitations, I would get shakes, I would feel physically ill when I talked about it. Now I can talk about it without, as you can see, with like a smile on my face, but at the time it was really traumatic. But I just want to say to the people gathered here, I'm sure there are people here who are going to go really far in their careers, because this is a fantastic university, and I hope that if you are ever faced with a decision that is all about humanity, morality, and about the values and ethics of a common good, of one world, and the fact that we're all human beings, that you will make the right decision and not think only about yourself. Thank you very much.
We've got a panel tonight with a number of people who have acted heroically, including our next speaker, Martin Bright, a renowned British journalist. He's been the political editor of the New Statesman since 2005. Before that, he was an editor for 9 years at the London Observer. In 2003, when at the Observer, he was handed a copy of Catherine's leaked document describing the NSA operation. He did what others did not have the good sense or courage to do. He recognized it as real and risked prison to publish its contents. His story created a media firestorm in the UK and around much of the world, not in the US, unfortunately. He's an authority on the colonial history of North Africa, and it's great that he came here on such short notice and for such a brief period of time from England in order to participate in this event. Martin Bright.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I won't bore you with the history of colonialism in North Africa tonight. I think that will you have to invite me again to do that. Look, I've been asked to explain my role in this affair, and really, I mean, it's always very difficult to follow Catherine when she's spoken and speaks of some genuine bravery. What we did on the Observer, in fact, was really quite simple. And I don't want to go into too much detail about it tonight because I don't think actually that is where the kind of heroism lies at all. What we did is what journalists should do, which is we found a source, we got a leak, and we put it in the newspaper. I mean, that is what people do in the media, and that's what they should do. And one of the sort of wider lessons to draw from this, I think, is, or the wider questions to ask, is why there isn't more of that going on. Now, just to very simply explain what did happen, Catherine explained that she received this this memo from, or email from, I mean, its ultimate origins was from a man called Frank Koza, who has the most fantastic name. I mean, one of the reasons we had some difficulty believing that this might be true is because Frank Koza had a name that so kind of came out of Hollywood villainry that, that we couldn't really believe that it was actually a real name. But as you'll see, I mean, that became part of the story, the verification, really. Quite simply, a journalist called Yvonne Ridley, who's gone on to fame and some notoriety as well as an anti-war campaigner, a Muslim convert, one of the most popular speakers in the Middle East, in fact, now. I worked with her for a long time on the newspapers in London, and she was a very eccentric character, not entirely trusted by everybody. She had quite literally worked for every single newspaper in Britain and been sacked from most of them as well. So she was hard drinking, she was dangerous, and a lot of people didn't want to deal with her. But she was an old-style Fleet Street journalist, and I really liked her. I still like her, even though we disagree on so much about Middle East politics. But what happens, we met in a cafe, Yvonne handed over this note and told me, as she often did, that this was the most explosive story that had ever happened. I mean, it happened before, with obviously when she'd found out exactly what happened with the conspiracy to kill Princess Diana. That was one of her favourite stories, I remember. So you had to be careful when Yvonne came to you with a sort of world sensation. But it was true that when we saw what was in the memo, which was that Frank Koza, one of the senior figures in the NSA, had ordered GCHQ in London to help with this surge, a word which has obviously come to have a different kind of resonance. He wanted Britain to take part in this surge against UN swing nations. On the face of it, I mean, it did look like an extraordinary story. The problem was, as I pointed out to Yvonne at the time, she could have typed it out. I mean, all it was a load of words on a piece of paper. On the back of it, handwritten, was the header information from the email to give us a clue as to sort of who it had come from. So this guy, Frank Koza's name, was just written on the back. Now, this all went back to Catherine's ingenious plan to keep everything anonymous. In fact, it was so ingenious that it made it almost impossible to get the story out because there was no way of verifying it. This is not the tale of a normal whistleblower because, I mean, usually when you work with a whistleblower, they've come to you physically, you work together with them, you come to agreements like the classic journalistic agreement when you meet in a room and you say, this meeting's never happened. If anyone asks you, deny everything. If you're ever arrested, say no comment. I had no opportunities to say that to Catherine because I didn't meet her because there were these two people. There was the person that Catherine handed the original piece of paper to, and then Yvonne Ridley herself. So it wasn't a normal whistleblower relationship. And then what we did when I took this away from the cafe, in a certain amount of kind of consternation for Yvonne wasting my time again, when we looked at it and when we worked as a team, me as a sort of home affairs specialist who'd worked on intelligence stories in Britain. I also worked with my colleague Peter Beaumont, who was an expert on foreign intelligence, and Ed Vulliamy, who was our New York correspondent to do the UN side of things. It started to build up, the credibility started to build up around the story, but very, very slowly. And of course, time was something that we didn't have because the war was coming. In the end, in fact, it was a pure stroke of luck that Ed rang the NSA. He'd been ringing them every day for about 3 weeks. to talk to their press office to ask whether this guy, Frank Koza, existed, and of course just got the normal reply, we can either confirm or deny, etc., etc. But then what happened was that, by pure chance, one of these calls was put through to Frank Koza's office, and Frank Koza's secretary answered and said, hello, Frank Koza's office. And so I went, oh, great, that's really good. Can I speak to Frank, please? And this woman said, yes, who is it? And Ed said, it's Ed Vulliamy from the London Observer. And she said, and who did you want to speak to? And he said, well, Frank Koza. And she said, no one hear of that name. But the point was that was enough. And as this sort of built up, by that stage, we talked to intelligence experts in Britain and America, some of whom are here today, in fact, about whether the internal language of this memo looked like it could be real. And they said that they were pretty sure it was, apart from, in fact, our sources in MI6, the British Foreign Intelligence Service, who said that it was very likely to be an extremely sophisticated Russian forgery, which sent us in. That's a bit annoying, really, that was. But and then I suppose the sort of last stage, we were, when we published, we were 99% sure that this was the real thing. Of course, at this stage, we didn't know Catherine was there. She hadn't been arrested. She hadn't confessed to this. So when it actually appeared in the newspaper and on the internet, there's always a moment when you do these stories where you think, oh my God, actually, there is still that 1%. Maybe this is, the Hitler Diaries, or this is we're all going to lose our reputations over this. And the story was initially picked up big time by Matt Drudge, the very good but very right-wing, what would you call him, blogger, journalist, I don't know. It was great for us in a way, getting such coverage in the Drudge report. He said, very straight, he kind of hyped it a little bit, I suppose. He said Condoleezza Rice has ordered this operation. But then he noticed that, in fact, when Catherine said that what she saw on the front page of the Observer was an exact replica, it actually wasn't an exact replica, because some brilliant young thing on the Observer had put the thing through a spell check, and in fact it was spelt with British spelling rather than American spelling. And so Drudge changed the front page of the website and said, forgery, London Observer tricked by, da-da-da. And that was a bad moment, because I didn't have the memo on me at that time. It was still in the office. I was at home, and I just thought, it was just the worst 2 hours of my life as I rushed into the office to find the memo. And anyway, it was spelt with American spelling in the original, and as you'd expect. And so that meant that the story could go on. But actually, I think that what's quite interesting about this is that there's been a lot said in discussions about this story about why the American media didn't pick it up. Some of that, I think, has, as I'll say a bit later, has to do with the fact that it was a British story. There's a certain amount of kind of resentment, and they didn't want to pick it up, or perhaps that there was some pressure on them. But actually, some of it was to do with the fact that you have to do these things very quickly, and that Drudge kind of knocked it in a completely different direction. And I think some of it was more cock-up than conspiracy. I don't want to go on too long, but I just wanted to make a couple of points about whistleblowers, if that's okay. Is that okay? Can I just, about the sort of nature of whistleblowing? Whistleblowers come to you as a journalist, not the other way around. You don't choose your whistleblowers, they choose you. And as someone who's dealt with quite a lot of them, I did want to give a little sort of character sketch, because people have this idea that there's a sort of pure realm of heroic whistleblowing, which only actually applies in Catherine's case, and it's got a pure zone of journalism, and that's just not the way it works. But what I would say is that whistleblowers are remarkable people. They're extraordinarily brave, often loners, sometimes really quite strange, actually. Though, again, not in Catherine's case. They can be obsessive, self-obsessed, little bit creepy sometimes. But again, obviously not Catherine. The idea that there's this sort of perfect, well-balanced, well-informed, eloquent sort of deep throat, it just isn't the case, except obviously there. And in fact, it's no joke in a way, because that's why the British government found it so difficult to take Catherine on, because she was the perfect whistleblower. They couldn't find any dirt on her. They couldn't find anything wrong with her. If she had stood up in court, I think they would have found it very, very difficult to be shown to be bullying a person of such sort of obvious principle. And at the same time, there's not a sort of perfect relationship between the heroic whistleblower and the kind of crusading journalist either, because although the idea is that journalists can give sources protection, that is the sort of number one kind of point of your journalistic credo is that you must protect your sources. Of course you can't. I mean, you just cannot guarantee total protection. I've had dealings with 3 very, very high-profile whistleblowers, and the stories of each of them are a recommendation never, ever to come to me with a story. I've just got a note tonight, actually, from a man called Derek Pasquill, who Catherine knows very well, who's a man who leaked. It was a journalistic dream, and it was literally a brown envelope full of documents from the Foreign Office about their relationship with radical Islam in Britain and around the world. It was great. It provided me with stories for the best part of 6 months. He's just said, "Hi Martin, as expected, I've received a telephone call from the Foreign Office this afternoon informing me that they've upheld the disciplinary panel's decision." And what that means is the disciplinary panel's decision was to summarily dismiss Derek from his job. He's 54 years old. He'll find it very difficult to find work again, having been sacked for what was essentially gross misconduct in leaking. He went through an official secrets trial like Catherine, which again was dropped at the last minute on the steps of the Old Bailey, the biggest court in Britain, the highest court in Britain. And again, there was no real explanation as to why they did it, but they made his life a misery for even longer than Catherine, in fact. Catherine herself has ended a promising career as a translator of Mandarin, and I think it's probably fair to say, Catherine, although I haven't cleared this with you, at times found it very, very difficult, and in particular found it very difficult to make ends meet. I mean, it was a very difficult thing to do. And the third case, going further back, a man called David Shaler, who was an MI5 officer, who leaked really an enormous amount of stuff. But in particular, he leaked documents that suggested that there were plans by the British government, by rogue elements in MI6, to assassinate Colonel Gaddafi. After going to prison in France and England, he decided that he ended up being one of those people that decided that 9/11 was an inside job carried out by missiles disguised as planes by holograms, and has now decided that he's the Messiah. So that's that. Now, I just want to say very, very quickly, the Catherine Gunn case has really bugged me over the years. And actually, journalistically, I just don't think we did enough, and that applies to me and the Observer as well as other journalists. I wonder, every time I think about the case, I wonder what would have happened if we'd gone earlier with the story, if we hadn't gone for the 99% risk, but, gone a bit sooner, And in fact, the press and the media are very rarely seriously at risk in these things. This case raises serious questions for the US media. Why did your journalists not take the trouble to find out what was really going on? What did COSA do? What blackmail was used, and who authorised it? Those questions are still valid now. And in the UK, why was the case dropped? Was it, as Catherine suggested, because of the Attorney General's advice that they were worried about being released? Was it because Catherine was such a perfect whistleblower and would have been such a perfect witness? Or was it actually, as they said at the time in a press release and in Parliament, that new intelligence came to light which showed that they could not fight Catherine's defence, which was a defence of necessity, saying that she did what she did in order to defend the imminent loss of human life. And those questions are still there to be asked, and I think, I mean, just as a last thought, that the media still has a lot to do, and it still has a lot to do even in this case. Thank you.
Let me say that none of Martin's description of whistleblowers applies to our next speaker. Daniel Ellsberg is the world's most famous whistleblower, the inspiration for those who uncover wrongdoing in government and find the courage to speak out. On the surface, he might seem like an unlikely candidate for the job. From 1954 to 57, he served as a rifle company commander in the U.S. Marine Corps. From 1958 to 64, and then again from 67 to 70, he worked as a strategic analyst for the Rand Corporation. From 61 to 64, he served as consultant to the Defense Department, State Department, and White House on command and control of nuclear weapons and on strategic nuclear war plans, and from 1967 to 69 on Vietnam. From 64 to 65, he was Special Assistant to the Assistant Secretary for Defense for International Security Affairs, and in August of 65, he volunteered to go to Vietnam and transferred to the State Department as a senior liaison officer under Major General Edward Lansdale, who figures prominently in Oliver Stone's movie JFK, as my students know. Upon his return to the U.S. in 1967, Dan worked on a study of U.S. involvement in Vietnam known as the McNamara Study. In 1969, he copied and gave the entire study to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and later in June 1971, after the invasions of Cambodia and Laos, to the New York Times, Washington Post, and 15 other newspapers, for which he faced 115 years in prison. Efforts to prevent Dan from disclosing additional documents by members of the Nixon administration, including led to acts including the famous break-in at Dan's psychiatrist's office that figured prominently in the conviction of several White House aides and the impeachment proceedings brought against the president. Charges against Dan were subsequently dismissed. In recent decades, Dan has been one of the world's most dedicated and tireless anti-war activists. And 2 years ago, Dan accompanied my students and me on a spring break trip to Vietnam, which was Dan's first visit back to Vietnam since the 1960s. The Vietnamese accorded Dan a hero's welcome and gave him the nation's highest friendship award. Dan Ellsberg.
Thank you very much. I did an endorsement of Martha Mitchell's and Marsha Mitchell. Oh. The older people will know what a gaffe that was. Marsha Mitchell and Thomas Mitchell's book, which I just reread, and which I'll read to you. No one has had this story to tell before, because no one else, including myself, has ever done what Catherine Gunn did. Tell secret risks at personal risk before an imminent war, in time possibly to avert it. Hers was the most important and courageous leak I've ever seen, more timely and potentially more effective than the Pentagon Papers. Now, I gave that quote to British papers as soon as I'd seen that story come out and before anyone had been identified with it, before Catherine Gunn's name had come out. And I said, this is potentially more important and more effective than the Pentagon Papers. And that reflected a couple of things from my own background as I read that story. First of all, I guess, Catherine, when you described how shocked you were and startled when you read the account, let me guess we haven't discussed this, that it was because you were seeing a verbatim transcript of that. Isn't that it? You'd given the story and you hoped that it would get out, but it must have been startling to see the verbatim part. And the reason that would be so startling is, first of all, that it would make it much easier to identify who the person was. And second, when I looked at that, I knew right away I'd never seen a document like that. In a sense, I'd never seen one. And let me explain that. I had, and the very existence of these clearances used to be a secret, but apparently isn't now. They're always talking about SCI and special compartmented intelligence and special clearances and whatnot, which the very existence of which was a very well kept secret when I was in the government and when I was a consultant. As a special assistant to the assistant secretary, I had all the clearances he had, and I had 12 of these special clearances, higher than top secret. And you had to have top secret to have any of those. And if you had only top secret, you would not have been aware that any of these existed. I knew that that document required a clearance I hadn't had. It was for operational efforts of the National Security Agency in our case. And I had had access to the output of the National Security Agency, that is what their intercepts and various things, which was a special clearance. But this was actually naming a person and saying, here's what we want, here's when we want it, here's what we want to get it, and so forth. And I knew that was an operational clearance that was even higher, or super secret, more closely held than I'd ever seen. I'd never seen a leak like that. And as I say, in the government, I'd never held that particular kind of piece of paper. So I know that, they are going to be able probably to identify who did this with all the markings on that piece of paper, and B, that person is in for it, and had to know that they were going to be in for it, and was going to be in for prosecution in the UK with their Official Secrets Act, but actually that would have been illegal in this country under communications intelligence. So the person who did that was clearly risking and even taking a likelihood of prison, I knew right away, in contrast to nearly every other leak I've seen. And of course, in my own case, putting out 7,000 pages of top secret documents, which, as my own lawyer put it to me, has a bad ring to it, and subjected me to prosecution, even though I was the first person ever prosecuted for a leak in the United States. Almost no one knows that, that's the way things are, and that's because we don't have an Official Secrets Act such as the UK does. And that's another story. I won't go into it here. We had a revolution. They don't have a First Amendment, actually, that forbids a law that would prevent the officials from giving information to the sovereign public that they have a right to have. But we do have some narrow Official Secrets Act, and one of those does cover communications intelligence of this sort. So clearly, they would have been prosecuted, and I will even say that if the NSA had known that was coming out in an American paper, I believe that not only the Bush administration, but earlier administrations would have gone for an injunction and would have gotten it. Some of you know that the injunction of the Pentagon Papers was the first in our history because the First Amendment was specifically intended to prevent prior restraint of that sort, among other things. So they'd never tried before. It was an experiment by Nixon, and he failed. The Supreme Court found that unconstitutional. But in the case of the communications intelligence, with the actually existing law making that illegal, I would guess that any of these presidents could have gotten an injunction, could do it in the future, or could do it right now. So here was the risk being taken. On the other hand, as she put it to me later, she said, as she read this was an illegal act, had to do with requesting an illegal act to carry on an illegal war. Now, illegal acts are no surprise. I'm sure she'd been 2 years with GCHQ, so she had seen before, as I certainly had seen before the Pentagon Papers, a lot of lying, a lot of illegal acts by the government. She was not a naive person who said, oh my goodness, you know, the government could never do anything like this. But this was in pursuit of a war that was clearly illegal in the absence of a UN resolution, because there are only 3 cases, I would say, and I got the number wrong here, of what can make, since the UN Charter was adopted, what can make a war legal. One is self-defense, immediate self-defense, which clearly was not involved here. And second, I should just say 2, a UN resolution authorizing it. Otherwise, what we have is a war of aggression, a crime against the peace of the sort for which generals and civilians were hanged at Nuremberg and in Tokyo. Now, without that UN resolution, the invasion and attack and occupation of Iraq were clearly a war of aggression, as clearly as the acts of aggression for which the Germans and Japanese were hanged, indicted and hanged, or let us say more recently, as clearly as Saddam's invasion of Kuwait, which mustered up a coalition against him, including his neighbors in the Middle East, against this clear-cut aggression, or the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and one could name a number of other recent ones. To be in that category was shameful and disheartening, disgusting for an American citizen to contemplate, for someone like myself who had been an official to contemplate. I have to correct one thing, a frequent mistake. I wasn't a company commander for 3 years in the Marine Corps. I was in the Marine Corps for 3 years. I was a company commander for several months, and as it happens, I look back on that at 77 as probably the most satisfying professional job I ever had, the rifle company commander. And the Marine Corps, in fact, is one of the associations in my life of which I'm least ashamed compared to the Office of Secretary of Defense, State Department, various others, the Rand Corporation. They do less lying on the whole, actually, and they're not very involved with nuclear weapons. So I'm in many ways less embarrassed by that. But so I saw that what this was clearly an attempt to avert a war, and that what was happening was something that I've been asking people to do for several years, leading up, actually in the months leading up to that impending aggression, since in the absence of an Iraq war, but especially since then, I should say. Since then, I've been asking people to do something that Catherine Dunn alone has done. I repeat, as I said in the book, to take a risk of their careers, a risk of their freedom, a risk of their professions, many risks, in many cases risks with their marriage, which, by the way, was very much involved in Catherine's case, because although she was fully supported by her husband, it was a situation where her husband, then an alien in England, could well have been deported. So she was facing the immediate threat on her marriage. But actually, whistleblowing in general breaks up most marriages. I was an exception here, lucky, in fact, very lucky. My wife and I just had our 38th anniversary. The trial brought us together. That was almost unknown. Most trials, anti-war trials, broke up marriages. And a study of whistleblowers has made the statistical conclusion that the average length of a marriage after the whistleblowing occurs is about 1.5 years. Because the spouse, whether man or woman in this case, did not sign up in the marriage for the kinds of pressure and the loss of all friends, the loss of income, the loss of children's schooling in many cases, that is involved in whistleblowing. So it's not something to be done lightly, obviously, that's to put it lightly. In almost any case, even though, as I said, in the US, prosecution has almost never been involved. At the same time, there's been no challenge of prosecution. of the kind that Catherine Gunn did, unfortunately. What I have been saying now for 4 years with her example in mind is this, to people who might hear me in the American officialdom. Don't do what I did. Don't wait till the war has started. Don't wait till the bombs are falling. Don't wait till thousands more have died before you do what I wish I had done when I was in the Pentagon in 64, 65, when I had the documents in my safe that showed we were being lied into a war as egregiously, as criminally and blatantly, as unconstitutionally, as was true under Bush, or these other aggressors, most of whom didn't have a constitution, but they were all breaking international law. Don't wait like that did. I didn't think of doing it then. I would blame myself more if I had thought and I'd shied away from it, but there was no precedent for me, and I didn't have Catherine Gunn's example, I could say, and I didn't think of doing it. I would like people to reflect on what Catherine Gunn specifically did do in the timely way before the war. She did what I did years later, when I no longer had access to current documents that I think could have had a much stronger effect on the public than the Pentagon Papers was likely to have. It was history. It was over before the current President Nixon was in office already. I really had very little hope that it would end a war or shorten a war, but I thought it might. And that seemed clearly to have be worth it. Now, after the event with Catherine, a number of people said, well, how could she have thought that it was worth not only these risks, but breaking the promise she had made? That's why it was risky. Breaking the law, in her case, less clear, well, I thought I was breaking the law at the time. But in her case, no question, breaking the law in Britain and risking prison and breaking a promise. Very honor, conscience is at the heart of Catherine Gunn, as anyone who's met her at all can perceive, as a jury would have perceived, probably. So what could have led her to this? After all, how could she imagine that putting this out would have a serious effect on the war? Well, her prime minister, unlike any American official, had said earlier that they would not go to war. He would not go to war without a UN resolution. Isn't that right, Martin? Am I right there? So she had reason to believe that if the UN failed to endorse this otherwise clear aggression, that maybe her leader, her country, would not participate. And if her country didn't participate, there was a lot of people saying the U.S. is going to have a lot of trouble. Powell, the Secretary of State, was clearly adopting this position. Without at least one major ally to support us, it's very dubious that we should be doing this, even with or without a UN resolution. And in this case, I think she had good reason to hope that this could prevent a UN resolution, and I will say others, I suspect that others here are not going to comment on the effects here, so I do want to, my time is up, but I do want to take 2 more minutes, I'm sorry, to lay out what seems to me so important. Not only was it reasonable of her to hope that it would have this effect, it did have a very big effect. Although it was blacked out in this country virtually as effectively as the Soviet press might have done it. It was, as the internet would show you right away, you can look back on this, it was front page news all over the world, everywhere but here, including 2 members of the Security Council in particular, Mexico and Chile, the not permanent members, who had both had governments overthrown by U.S. covert operations and whose public were very sensitive about being blackmailed and manipulated covertly by the U.S. Made it virtually impossible for Mexico and the Chile, who wanted to go with the U.S. and not jeopardize their own economic relations with the U.S. Their officials just could not, in the face of that leak, vote. And without Mexico and Chile, with virtually nobody, but I think Bulgaria was a possibility, and Britain, behind them, the U.S. withdrew the resolution, which unfortunately for the world, for the U.S., for Iraq, for how many people, unfortunately, did not prevent the U.S. from going ahead with that aggression, or for that matter, Britain. Nevertheless, it was not unreasonable to hope that they might have obeyed the UN Charter, they might have obeyed in the face of this, and other countries did back off, and the effect was that it did deny this operation of this false cloak of legitimacy that would otherwise have happened. And so the upshot of that is, I think what she did represented her intelligence as well as her conscience, her realism, did not strike her as naive, and it also meant that she was and is my hero. I have other heroes, but I have no hero more than Catherine Gunn. And I would like her example to be an example to Americans and to people all over the world. We will not avoid nuclear war. We will not, I think, avoid an Israeli-U.S. attack on Iran. We will not avoid many future catastrophes without people showing more heroism, more courage in risking their careers than we have yet seen from any Americans, and officials, I should say. There are people outside officials who are doing all they can to avoid this war, but that is not true of any member of Congress, I have to say, or any member of officialdom. And it's necessary. So there's no example more important for people to focus on than that of Catherine Gunn. Thank you.
Okay, Peter Ernest was a career CIA operations officer for 36 years. He spent over 10 years in Europe and the Middle East engaged in active intelligence operations. Peter held various other senior positions, including Director of Media Relations, and was the CIA spokesman from 1989 to 1994. He was awarded the agency's Intelligence Medal of Merit for superior performance throughout his career. Peter is chairman of the board of directors of the Association for Intelligence Officers and executive director of the extremely popular International Spy Museum here in Washington. Peter Ernest.
Maybe you can give me back 3 minutes of my time it took to get here, be in front of you. Thank you very much for inviting me. And Marcia and Tom, whom I've known for some time and helped to publicize their book, The Woman Who Seduced America, about Judith Kaplan. I'm coming to you this evening as a practitioner of intelligence. I am not trying to speak on behalf of the government. I'm not trying to speak on behalf of CIA, although what experiences I may share with you, obviously, for the most part, were in CIA. Let me give you a little detail, a little bit more detail on my background, because it may help to put my remarks in context. I was indeed in the operations directorate for some 25 years. And that, of course, is the side that is the clandestine service side of CIA, now known as the National Clandestine Service, in the wake of 9/11 and the commission which mandated certain changes in the intelligence community. In that time, I worked for the last 10 years or so on the Soviet Union and East Europe. Was involved in a number of cases which you've probably read about because a number of them were exposed by Rick Ames, who was indeed a traitor, is now doing life in prison, and who worked for me at one time. And if you read his rationale, you will see that he depicts himself as something of a whistleblower. In other words, what he did was to help Soviet and American relations. What he did, unfortunately, resulted in at least 10 deaths of Soviets who were working covertly with CIA. The other jobs that I held that might be of interest, I was with the Inspector General for some 3 years, and I dealt with a number of cases which dealt in some cases with dissent within the agency. I was at one point chief of our Senate relations staff, that is our liaison with the U.S. Senate and with the individual senators. And then in my last incarnation, I was indeed the Director of Media Relations and spokesman for 3 directors, including Bob Gates, now Secretary of Defense. When Marcia brought the book to my attention, interestingly, I recalled the case, but not very much about it. So really the first occasion I've had to learn any details has been in now reading the book by Marcia and Tom. I think it is interesting in the accounts this evening that this event, this incident of Catherine's whistleblowing got coverage in all the papers of the world except in the United States. There may be the implication somehow that the intelligence community or the administration leaned on the press. I can tell you as a former director of media relations, there were many times I wished I had that kind of leverage, but I never did. It is, I think, one of the features of our country that in those cases where I might have contacted, and I did, members of the press, either the editorial board or usually the reporting staff, all I could do was bring to the attention of the media whatever my concern might be. It was always the decision of the media as to whether to print or not, and that's the way our system works. Now let me just come to the, so we don't get drawn too much out in time here, let me come to the nub of this here, which is Catherine Gunn's act. I certainly would not challenge anybody's act of conscience. I think that we each grow up, we have our parents, our upbringing, our schooling, and all those things that go into what leads us to determine that something is right or wrong. I think that Marcia and Tom have done a very fine job of giving the details of Catherine's decision. I also think that they've done a great job of sort of drawing out a very detailed narrative of the effects as they saw it within Great Britain, almost none of which we understood here. But going to Catherine's act, I think in thinking about it and thinking about my own experience and in thinking about others I had dealt with in the agency, Catherine was a young woman. I think you said she was 27 when she was arrested. She had been in GCHQ, the equivalent of the American NSA, for something like 2 years, a very new employee. She was a translator. You can, if you want, include everybody in an agency as being an intelligence officer. She was, in fact, a translator. She had grown up, mastered Mandarin Chinese and some Japanese, and so she had joined, on her own, an agency whose business was spying. The GCHQ, like the NSA, is an organization in our respective countries conducting SIGINT, signals intelligence. So I have to believe that Catherine was well aware of what her job entailed, that she was in fact translating the meetings, conversations, whatever, of people who were taped, overheard, or whatever, unbeknownst to them. So this is, of course, espionage. We come then to the email, the NSA email, which, by the way, I have not seen. I don't know, Marcia, if that's... no, but I mean, it's not in the book or in the press, and there may be an explanation for that, and I meant to ask you that this evening. I have not seen the email. But I think in thinking about the action that Catherine was apparently very interested in current affairs, watched television every night, saw an email, and decided that it was her responsibility to stop the war, as she saw it. I see that as an extraordinary leap. The other thing I think that concerned me somewhat was, and I credit both Catherine's honesty and Marcia's reporting, to point out that the GCHQ did have a memorandum saying, you know, and I'm not quoting it verbatim, but we realize some of you may have ethical issues concerning what may happen in Iraq, and if you do, and you would like to meet with one of the senior managers or one of the following, and they listed 3 officers. By the description in the book, Catherine was very dismissive of that. Mind you, having been in the organization 2 years and suddenly deciding that something had to be leaked, to suddenly decide that the organization was utterly bereft of conscience, that it was utterly bereft of the means to express one's concern, I think is a big leap. We have, now, again, I will now go to my own experience. We have dealt with this issue many times in CIA. When I was head of the Senate staff, I accompanied Director Turner to a closed hearing on the Hill, and it concerned a very sensitive operation in the Middle East. Director Turner was asked by the chairman of the Oversight Committee, which is a very active committee. Director Turner, he said, do your officers agree with you on this action that you're proposing? He said, no, sir, they do not. And they said, well, can you give us some sense of their dissent? And he said, yes, I can. He said, I brought their memoranda up with me. And so there are many ways, in my experience, to dissent within an organization. And I will tell you that any agency officer today who is concerned about an operation or an intercept of signals intelligence certainly has the recourse to go to his own, someone who is a mentor, someone who's close, to discuss it. They certainly can go to the Inspector General. It will be kept in confidence. The Inspector General is now approved by the U.S. Senate and may report directly to the President of the United States. He does not even have to go to the director of the agency. And any officer may also go to a member of the Oversight Committee, either in the House or the Hill. Now, I cannot speak to the issue of GCHQ and what means that they may have for somebody to register dissent or concern. I think it's very, very important for those mechanisms to exist. And I think it's unfortunate that Catherine, in her position, did not have faith in what her organization was offering her as a possible means for expressing her concerns about what she was seeing. I will not get into the sort of the British political side of it. It was interesting to me recently. I spoke to the Soviet, let me take that back, Russian intelligence officer who was the deputy resident. That is the #2 man in New York, in Manhattan, recently. His name is Sergei Trechikov, and I interviewed him on C-SPAN. Some of you may have seen it, and of course you can go and get it. And Trechikov was very clear about his activities in Manhattan. He had responsibility for recruiting people, Americans, but he said his most lucrative place for finding people and recruiting people was the UN. To our knowledge, and I think the FBI has confirmed that in their public statements, there are as many Russians now as there were during the Cold War spying on this country. And the UN, as Tom is well aware, the co-author of the book, and as I am well aware, they typically highly target the UN. There are a lot of spying activities going in the UN. There are a lot of spying activities directed against our country by foreign representatives in New York and elsewhere. The issue of eavesdropping, of NSA or GCHQ activities is something that has been discussed often in the press. I think at one point Catherine, or rather Marcia, noted in the beginning of the book, but that Catherine knew very little about NSA. There was, of course, the seminal work by Jim Bamford on NSA, and I think he actually published more about NSA than they knew about themselves. So, and he's now done a second volume. So any of you who may be interested in NSA, There's plenty of reading material out there. And I think on that issue of Catherine's act, again, I certainly can only credit someone for following their own conscience. On the other hand, I do question at that time her sense of realism, because I think that not having a realistic sense of what she might have done within the organization and a realistic sense of what she was looking at in the years ahead, I think did not help her at that time. So I think it's an interesting tale. I understand why probably the media did not pick it up here to the detail elsewhere, and there was a lot going on. There were people opposed to the war. It was very controversial. And I think as a single act in Great Britain, it didn't make the leads. And whether anyone in the future will pick this up as significant in that sense, I don't know. I think many of you are students of government, and I think it's probably never been a better time to be alive if you're trying to understand what's going on in your government. Books like Woodward's books, Richard Clarke's book, Your Government Failed You, and other books, even Tennant's book. Yes, you can say some of these books are written from their own point of view, but I still think you can read them and have a tremendous sense of what is taking place in your government and how it works. And this is how the system works right now. And I think those who seek to dissent or to gainsay what is going, there are mechanisms. There are plenty of papers on the right or the left or the center, however you want to describe it. When I was in CIA, I was known as a proponent of openness and transparency to the extent possible. We are, after all, talking about intelligence organizations. But I felt that to the degree we could, it was important to share with the American people, certainly just as we were with the oversight committees, the information we could about the activities of CIA, and I could not speak, of course, for other agencies. Before closing, by the way, I was an admirer of your actions with the Pentagon Papers, Dan, and as you recall, one of the things they pointed out was that the agency had called right a number of issues in Vietnam. And it is the role of intelligence to speak truth to power, which is, however you may fault the community or the agency for its performance on some things, like calling WMD, there are other things, such as refusing to go along with the administration's allegation that there were contacts between Saddam Hussein and the terrorists who carried out 9/11. The agency consistently stood against that and never went along to what had been the administration line. And interestingly, to give some sense of the public, I think there is still a significant percentage of the American public who still believe that. So we are always dealing with perceptions. We are dealing with a public whose attention span is relatively short. And so things like doing what you're doing, which is focusing on things and trying to pay attention to the details, are greatly valuable for your learning. So it's been a pleasure for me to be here this evening. Thank you again for inviting me, and I certainly wish all of you the best of luck in the years ahead, and I hope some of you consider public service. American University has a reputation for that. I've spoken to classes before, and even though mine was a peculiar form of public service, since it was secret, it was still public service, and it was still about our country. Okay? Thank you.
That's precisely the kind of thoughtful, critical perspective we were hoping for tonight. We had another person scheduled to be on the panel who we know is a pretty fierce critic of what Catherine did, but unfortunately he had to drop out. Our penultimate speaker is Ray McGovern. Ray is a retired CIA officer turned political activist. Ray was an intelligence analyst under 7 U.S. presidents for 27 years, from 1964 to 1990. His duties at CIA included chairing the National Intelligence Estimates and preparing the President's daily brief. From 1981 to 85, he conducted one-on-one early morning briefings of the PDB, with Vice President Bush, the Secretaries of State and Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and the National Security Advisor. Upon retirement, Ray was awarded the Intelligence Commendation Medal from Bush, which he later returned. He is active with the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, and Ray is now co-director of the Servant Leadership School, an inner-city outreach ministry in Washington, D.C.
Thank you for coming. Our scripture reading for today is from Jan Harwood, Catherine's mother. It's very brief, 3 words. Good for her. I would like to go from the general to the particular. I'd like to address first, in a more general sense, the ethics, the moral, the philosophical, or even theological aspects of what Catherine did, and then go to a couple of particular cases that I know pretty intimately, concrete cases, whistleblower cases, or lack of whistleblowing. Now, promises are very important things. We keep promises. They're serious, and secrecy agreements are among those serious promises. However, as in all ethical and moral considerations, there can be supervening values. The supervening values that trump things like obligations to secrecy. Now, how do we sort out those supervening values? Well, we have something called a conscience. And Catherine famously has said, I have always ever followed my conscience. Well, how do we sort through this and figure out what conscience can tell us? Well, number one, we can never suspend our conscience. We can't give our conscience over to leaders of church or state or anything else. And conscience has to do with circumstances. I mean, that's not a new insight. You can go back to Thomas Aquinas for that. There are always circumstances that attend whether an act is moral or immoral, ethical or unethical. So, in this case, we're talking about trying to prevent a war. And I think that could be looked on as a supervening value. Perhaps you'll agree. And this kind of supervening value does not only allow a person to break an earlier pledge to secrecy, it obliges that person. There is an ethical, a moral obligation to speak out to prevent an illegal, unnecessary war, and that's precisely what Catherine did. Now, one can object and say, well, consciences can be subjective. Of course they're subjective. They have to be informed. And Catherine indicated how closely she watched what was going on that year. So she had an informed conscience, okay? You have to know, ethics is like art, okay? You have to know where to draw the line. Now, I'd like to go through 2 short cases here. And like the rest of life, they're full of ironies. The first has to do with a colleague of mine. His name was Sam Adams. He was actually a direct descendant of John Adams, 13 times removed or something like that. But he came into the CIA the same year that I did, in the same junior officer trainee course under John F. Kennedy in April of 1963. I think actually that's the year that Peter came in. So I knew Sam quite well. He was out of Harvard. He was the quintessential analyst, and he found out in 1967 that there were twice as many Vietnamese communists under arms as General Westmoreland, the head of the military effort out there, was willing to acknowledge. He knew that General Westmoreland's staff agreed with him, Sam Adams, and he made the case as far as he could in Washington, but he got nowhere. The bogus figures, Westmoreland was carrying about 200,000 communists under arms. They were given the lie as soon as the Tet Offensive happened in late January, early February 1968, when a countrywide offensive occurred, and it couldn't have been done by 200,000. It was done by at least 500,000, all right? So Sam had exposed that, and yet he hadn't gotten to first base. The communist offensive during Tet, early 68, took most of Washington and Saigon by surprise. Why? Because the intelligence had been politicized. The intelligence had been suppressed. The intelligence given the president even had been diminished by a factor of 2. Now, Sam's effort to tell the truth to power, to expose, to spread some truth around about this was not very successful. This is 1968 we're talking about, and as you all know, the war dragged on for as many more years, with many, 20, 25,000 more Americans killed, not to mention the 2 to 3 million, think about it, guys, 2 to 3 million Vietnamese killed during that entire war, okay? Now, as often happens, there can be a happy aspect to this, and that is something that Dan Ellsberg should be crowing about, but being the kind of fellow he is, he never mentions it. So I feel compelled to mention it. Dan was aware of Sam Adams' accurate figures on Vietnam, and so after Tet, when Dan learned that General Westmoreland had made a formal request to our president for 208,000 more troops, which troops were going into Laos, Cambodia, and up to the North Vietnamese border, and perhaps even to China, guess what Dan Ellsberg did? He took Sam Adams' figures and gave them to the New York Times. This is years before the Pentagon Papers. The date was March 19th, 1968, at a time when there was a brutal reassessment of what to do about the war. March 1968, remember now, okay? And what happened? Well, we know what happened, because on March 25th, that's 6 days later, President Lyndon Johnson complained to a small gathering, quote, "The leaks to the New York Times really hurt us. We have no support for the war. I would have given Westmoreland the 208,000 troops." Thanks, Dan. You prevented that one. Now, what about Sam? What about Sam Adams? Well, Sam and I used to have lunch. And while all this was going on, he told me, "Ray, I've got to work within the system. The system's got to work. There's the Inspector General." And indeed, he went to the Inspector General of the CIA. He went to the Inspector General of the Department of Defense. He went to the various congressional committees. Zip, nada, nothing. They wouldn't get him to. He let himself be diddled. He let himself be diddled by the system, and he would not go public. Sam was unable to see the supervening value that trumps the obligation to secrecy. And the supervening value in this case was telling the truth about this godforsaken war so it could stop. Now, Sam finally went public, and this is one of the ironies, folks. He only went public when a fellow named Dan Ellsberg was on trial for revealing a whole host of secrets based on trumped up, convoluted, politicized intelligence. And Sam says to me, "You know, this is really something. They're going to send a guy to prison for revealing intelligence that had already been falsified. Man, I got to go to Los Angeles and testify in this. And so Sam went public, but it was too late. And Sam ended up full of remorse. He said, you know, Ray, if I had spoken up early enough, you know that Vietnam Memorial? I said, yeah. He said, that whole left side, it wouldn't be there, Ray. It wouldn't be there. You know why? Because if I had spoken up in 68, 69, those half of those 58,000 men would not have been killed. Or maybe there would have been an even chance that we could have put an end to this thing. That's a lot to carry on your shoulders. He died at 55 from an unexpected, very sudden heart attack. Now, one of the other ironies here is that we, Sam's colleagues, most of us, well, all of us retired now, set up something called Sam Adams Associates for Integrity and Intelligence. We decided to give an annual award to someone who stood out as someone who exercised integrity, honesty, and intelligence. And our first award was given to one Colleen Rowley. Some of you will remember her as the FBI person who wrote courageous letters to her director saying, look, you know, you really screwed up before 9/11, and now you're screwing up before the Iraq War, you know? What evidence is there that the FBI has of ties between Iraq and Al-Qaeda? She knew there was none. And you know what she warned about? She warned about the fact that preemptive actions could sort of play back into this country, and you would have preemptive attacks by the likes of what I saw personally in St. Paul, Minnesota during the Republican National Convention, where 3 rows of uniformed, black visored, tear gas armed police fired on a bunch of young people demonstrating for food, not bombs. That's the preemptive kind of attacks that come back to haunt. And she warned about that before the Iraq War. Anyhow, she was the first, and our second distinguished awardee was Catherine Gunn. And I went out to Copenhagen to give her that award. We were both speaking at a conference at that time. Now, what I'd like to say is that Catherine was able to see the supervening value, and I applaud her for that. And Dan was able to see it as well. And, you know, talk about idols. Well, Catherine is one of my heroes, too. And another is Rachel Corrie, whose dad gave me this thing, which says, Rachel Corrie, April 10, 1979, March 16, 2003. That was her brief lifespan. And I'm proud to wear it because it gives me courage. Ironically, they're both young women, and ironically, or not, you'll find most of the heroes that do these things happen to be women. Am I running close here? Or? No, I got a couple more minutes. So let me just tell you, Colleen Rowley, Catherine Gunn, recipients of this award, Sibel Edmonds, Craig Murray, former UK ambassador to Uzbekistan, Sam Provence, U.S. Army Sergeant at Abu Ghraib, and Frank Grayfield, a Danish intelligence officer who was just released from prison for telling the Danish people what the real story was before the war. Let me just close by referring to another irony, and that is that we were all here in September of 2004. That's when we congregated here at this table. Catherine was here. Frank Grayfield, just as I said, out of the Danish prison, was here. So was Colleen Rowley, and so was Sibel Edmonds, okay? Now, we issued that week, on September 9, 2004, a statement from what we called our Truth-Telling Coalition. And I'd just like to read you the last couple of sentences of this statement because it applies as well today in an incredibly ironic way as it did then. We're talking September 2004, 4 years ago. This is addressed to people within the government. We know, quote, "We know how misplaced loyalty to bosses, agencies, and careers can obscure the higher allegiance all government officials owe the Constitution, the sovereign public, and the young men and women put in harm's way. We urge you to act on those loyalties, those higher loyalties." 140,000 young Americans are risking their lives every day in Iraq for a dubious purpose. That was 4 years ago, folks. How many are there now? Come on, how many U.S. troops are in Iraq now? 140,000 or 150,000, okay? Our country is in urgent need of comparable moral courage from its public officials. Comparable moral courage to that being displayed by our troops on the line there in Iraq. And to those, I'm adding this, to those who might see the memo from Cheney and Bush to the Joint Chiefs of Staff saying, okay, implement Plan B on Iraq, on Iran, I appeal, and Dan, we all appeal to them to realize that truth-telling is patriotic. In the words of this statement, it's a patriotic and effective way to serve the nation, and the time for speaking out is now. Thank you very much.
Actually, that 2004 event was also at a session of my Oliver Stone's America class, as was the time we gave the award to Sam Provence. But let me mention something about another guest to this class once, Robert McNamara, former Secretary of Defense, who was the mastermind behind the Vietnam War. Ray said that 2 to 3 million Americans died, 2 to 3 million Vietnamese died in the war. When McNamara came in, he said 3.8 million Vietnamese died in the war. It's a shocking number. Norman Solomon, our last speaker, is a best-selling author, journalist, media critic, and anti-war activist. He is a longtime associate of the group Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting and founder of the Institute for Public Accuracy, a national consortium of policy researchers and analysts. His weekly column, Media Beat, has been in national syndication since 1992. While most of the US media ignored the Catherine Gunn story, Norman did not. It was his gathering of a group of American celebrities to appeal for fair treatment of Catherine that brought at least some attention to her case. He also wrote the foreword to the Mitchell's book. Let me say before Norman speaks that the Mitchell's book is on sale, and they'll be happy to sign copies of it. And those of my students who have brought Dan Ellsberg's terrific book, Secrets, that they're signed to read for the class, Dan, I think, will also be happy to sign copies of that. So, Norman Solomon.
By definition, special relationships are special. They're also sometimes routine, and I'm thinking of a couple of such relationships in particular. One, of course, is between Washington and London. And we saw, and people in Iraq experienced, some of the bitter and deadly fruit of that special relationship with the invasion and occupation of Iraq. And it would not surprise me if months or years from now, that special relationship, following the paradigms, if not the exact same situations, were to lead to an attack on another country named Iran instead of Iraq. George Orwell said very well that those who control the present control the past, and those who control the past control the future. And in that spirit, I think we're gathered here to try to understand more what happened in the past so we might affect in a positive way what's up ahead. Another special relationship in this country is between press and state. the close relationship between those who we call the Washington Press Corps and those who make national and international policy along Pennsylvania Avenue and at Foggy Bottom. And that special relationship has functioned in our lifetimes to drag this country on the basis of falsity and fabrication into one war after another. In his book, Roughing It, Mark Twain describes some individuals who are hiking through the woods. It is a snowy time, and they realize that they're lost, and as the time goes on, nightfall approaches, and it's getting colder and colder, and they're getting very worried. And finally, as they are in despair, they discover some tracks in the snow. And they realize they must be getting close to safe haven. And so they walk, and surprisingly, they don't get to safe haven. And not only do they not get to safe haven, but over time they notice that actually the tracks are getting wider and wider. And they realize at last that they have been going around in a circle. And I think that describes pretty well some of these special relationships. It describes the way in which we have, to add on to what Dwight Eisenhower described, a military-industrial media complex in this country where one paradigm after another simply embellishes itself. And so we have the Gulf of Tonkin incident, as it was reported, on the front pages of the Washington Post and the New York Times, absolute falsehoods from the White House, reported as absolute facts. And you fast forward a few decades and you find the WMD stories and other claims laundered from the favorite Iraqi exile of the Pentagon, Ahmed Chalabi, and so forth, reported as absolute fact on our newspapers of record front pages of the New York Times. Well, I think it's relevant to recall, for instance, that George Will, several months into the occupation of Iraq, George Will, the highly esteemed Washington Post syndicated columnist, said that doors would get kicked in Baghdad, that some things would be done by U.S. troops that were not pretty to look at or contemplate, but as George Will said, in his words, it is the first responsibility of government to establish a monopoly on violence. And this is a reigning mentality, which especially reigns in the country that has, under the command of its chief executive, the most powerful source of violence on the planet, namely the Pentagon. Well, almost 96 hours after, in early March of 2003, the Observer published the expose of the US-UK spying operation against delegations to the UN Security Council for the purpose of gathering more so-called diplomatic momentum for war. I called the New York Times because I could not help but notice that although this story, this expose of the fundamental dishonesty of the Bush and Blair regimes, this expose was front page everywhere around the world, it seemed, except on our continent, and not a word had appeared in the New York Times. And I reached a deputy foreign editor of the New York Times named Alison Smalley, and I asked her why the New York Times was not reporting this story. And being a journalist, I wrote down the exact words of her reply. She said, quote, "We would normally expect to do our own intelligence reporting," unquote, which would have been nice if they actually had done that. Well, as the executive director of the Institute for Public Accuracy, which has its offices in the National Press Building here in Washington and puts out news releases to about 9,000 journalists inside the United States, I was involved in putting out a number of news releases, which are still on the web at accuracy.org, to the newsrooms of this country, explaining what the facts were as reported by the Observer in London in early March of 2003. And it was, you might say, a very tough sell to get any sizable media outlet at all to even investigate, let alone do some actual reporting. We had then, and we have now, with some precious exceptions, conformity and silence as the rule. And the conformity and silence are integral to the reasons why the invasion of Iraq took place, integral to the reasons why the occupation of Iraq continues, integral to why there is a virtual consensus in the U.S. mass media that more troops must be sent to Afghanistan, and also part of the process by which the warfare state that we live in continues to perpetuate and expand itself. It is a highly lucrative mass culture based on inflicting death and misery. Martin Luther King spoke in 1967 about what he called the madness of militarism. 41 years later, we're in the midst of it, and so many have died in the interim, and so many more are in the crosshairs of that madness. Dr. King, and you won't see this either on the evening news when there's an anniversary of his death or a national celebration of his birthday. We all have seen countless times the eloquent "I Have a Dream" speech footage, but we have yet to see on the networks the available footage of Dr. King saying in 1967, a nation that year after year continues to spend more on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. That was 41 years ago, and we continue to approach. Now, people can take all kinds of leaps in their professional lives and in their personal lives, and maybe they are smart leaps, and maybe they are dumb leaps. Maybe they sustain life, or maybe they help to destroy it. I had the wisdom, at least as a high school student one day, to skip school and go down to Capitol Hill. This was a day, an afternoon weekday in February of 1968. And I got into a actually small room where the Senate Foreign Relations Committee was holding a hearing and was questioning a representative of the Johnson administration. And of course, this was several years into the Vietnam War. And recently I went back to the transcript of what I heard at that time as a teenager at the Foreign Relations Committee hearing. And I read the words of a senator who took a leap. A senator who took the kind of leap that we are still waiting for a U.S. senator to take in 2008. Wayne Moore said, "I do not intend to have the blood of this war on my hands." When I went to Baghdad in late 2002, and I walked through the streets, I thought about something that in his book, Neither Victims Nor Executioners, Albert Camus said. He said that we have a long shot. We have a possibility to try to create a situation in which words are more powerful than munitions. I walked through the streets of Baghdad and wondered, will my country, as I looked at people of all ages, including young children, I looked at those people in the streets in Baghdad, and I thought, will my country kill you? And I'm sure that among those I saw, the answer has turned out, for at least some, at least a few, to be yes. 3 years ago, I walked through the streets of Tehran, and the same question was in my mind, and how it turns out to be answered is in part up to us. Whether we conform to the dictates and the tacit messages of the warfare state, or whether we can not only individually but collectively take some sort of responsibility to help create history, not simply consume it like some kind of mass-produced Wonder Bread at the supermarket. You know, we hear a lot about risk, and these days we are hearing phrases like too big to fail. And we keep receiving messages through the news media, through our elected officials, through those who we are told know best, that the Pentagon is too big to fail, that we must defer to that great power which is visited upon the United States of America and put in the hands of the Commander-in-Chief. Interesting concept if we set aside most of the resonant meanings of democracy, in which case, if we set aside the meaning of democracy, then have at it. But if we believe that democracy is about us deciding as a country what the course of action should be in our names with our tax dollars, then clearly we have a lot of work to do, and that includes raising and exploring insistently the question, what is too small to matter? Is conscience too small to matter? Is the potential of democracy that we embrace with our lives, is that too small to matter? Is it too small to matter in our lives or in our society? I'd like to close by referring to the question of freedom. And of course, whenever we take risk, in some way we're worried that the freedom that we have or think we have or hope to have will be denied or foreclosed. Take a risk, we may not have the money we want. Take the risk, we may not have some of the bonds with other individuals or the institutional relationships, the jobs, the well-being that we imagine. That would be what the risk is that we're worried about. And sometimes in the case of whether it's whistleblowers or activists of various sorts, we may even worry that we will lose what we call our freedom. We'll lose our freedom because we'll be put behind bars, be incarcerated. And no one, of course, should take such a possibility lightly. But it's definitely worth considering that as we go about our lives in this country, in the United States of America, in the year 2008, that we are living in what could be called minimum security. We don't have the freedom to live in a country that devotes its resources to sustaining and healing as much as our society devotes its resources to destruction. Our country now spends $2 billion with a B dollars a day on the military, $2 billion a day, your and my money, on the warfare state. We live in minimum security. We have the option to help change that, to create a better world.
For more information about The Spy Who Tried to Stop a War, visit p3books.com/The Spy Who Tried to Stop a War.